If you ask me, this place is kinda creepy. Hundreds of dead people. Under your feet. They're everywhere. I'm Edward Turpen. Why, I'm probably the reason you're sitting there watching this right now. In my lifetime, I had 17 kids. 17! Here in Lawrence County. With the help of 3 wives, of course. As the good book says, I was being fruitful. We didn't have TV back then. And those kids had kids, and those kids had kids, and before you know it, there's hundreds of little wild-eyed Turpen heathens running around, just like you. But just look at all of these graves, though. Every single one represents a life lived, stories told, lots of interesting things. But they can't tell you anything now. Not a thing. That's my gravestone in the front, by the way. But I would like to tell you a few things. Our family story is a right bit interesting. So pull up a chair. You might learn something. We didn't always spell our name this way. In fact, the great evidence is that everyone in our family used to spell it Turpin. In fact, records show that the very first Turpins to come to these United States spelled it that way. You know, just how everyone gets it wrong today. They spelled it this way in Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky. In fact, the first time we were spelled Turpen was when Moses and Jenny Turpin came to Indiana in the 1830s, and Moses spelled his last name like we do today. There's a legal book at the Lawrence County Museum of History in downtown Bedford where you can see his actual signature. Bet you didn't know that. See, you are learning something. There's evidence that Turpins were living in France about 600 years ago, but spelled their last name Turpine. And if you really want to get technical, long before that, they spelled it Terrabin. And Terrabin literally means dweller at or near a tree from which turpentine is drawn. You know, that smelly stuff people use to clean tools. Hey, you're welcome. So if anyone ever called you turpentine, they didn't know how right they were. But the name goes back even further than that. Thorfinn. A few researchers have tied our family history to the Norse name Thorfinn, Thor being the god of thunder to the Vikings. Hey, you've seen him in movies. Yeah, this guy. Some Turpen family have even taken these newfangled DNA tests that prove we're linked to the Nordic Viking people. Yeah, it's pretty nifty. It explains a lot of things if you ask me. And it's probably no coincidence that more than a few of our family have blue eyes, like you'd expect from a good Nordic Viking. Hey, the ladies love the blue eyes. I should know. I had 17 kids. So how did us Vikings get to Bedford, Indiana? You know, I was getting to that. When you think of Vikings, you think of these big ships taking warriors to distant lands to fight and conquer. But they'd pretty much go anywhere and fight, even without a boat. The Vikings came down to France, took local gals for wives, went to the local churches with these wives, settled down, and blended in over time. They kind of forgot who they were. You know, marriage will do that to you. The only accepted church in France was the Catholic Church. Many people had beliefs outside the Catholic Church and were persecuted for it. Not just name-calling, but getting killed for it. One of these religious groups, called the Huguenots, banded together and went to England to escape this persecution. And likely, that's what happened to our relatives. You think this is a crazy theory? Hey, you're listening to a dead guy tell a story. I don't think I'd point fingers. In the 1600s, we find records of a Thomas Turpen married to Elizabeth Watts and living in England. They spell their last names Turpin. They had a son named Edward. Hey, just like me. And he married a gal named Elizabeth Mason. In 1650, they decide to move to America and start a new life in Maryland. Elizabeth is pregnant, but goes anyway. She ends up giving birth to William Turpen somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. William was the first Turpen not born in Europe. The American Revolution hadn't even happened yet, so they're all British citizens and probably talk funny, no doubt. Our Turpen ancestors settled in Somerset County, Maryland, then Monocan, Maryland, then Virginia. And it's there where they cross paths with a famous figure, Daniel Boone. Daniel told people he'd been to this wonderful place known as Kentucky, and anyone that went with him could have huge amounts of land and abundant hunting. So our Turpen ancestors, Moses Turpen and his wife Magdalena Black, did just that. They had a large amount of land, horses, and lots of kids. I mentioned they didn't have TV. The problem is that Daniel Boone was a lousy surveyor. So when people later came to Kentucky with proper surveys, many people already there lost their land. This made Daniel pretty unpopular, and he fled to what was Spanish territory. Moses' son, also named Moses, decided to take himself and his wife, Jenny Stevenson, to Indiana for the promise of free land and good surveys. Jenny was ready to go anyway and to leave behind very bad memories. Hey, get ready for a big dramatic story. Jenny Stevenson Turpen is actually famous in Kentucky pioneer history. Her family had lived here at Paint Lick, Kentucky, even before this brick building town and church was there. The church was organized in 1783, around the time Jenny's family lived there. But this brick building came much later. All the buildings were made with large logs back then. Jenny and her dad, mom, 2 little brothers, 2 sisters, and older brother lived along the Meadow Fork of Paint Lick Creek in a cabin similar to this one, except theirs had a second-story loft with a window. This was the early days of pioneer life, and the Shawnee Indians weren't happy with people living on their hunting grounds. In August of 1792, Jenny was asleep upstairs when her sister Patsy unbarred the cabin door that morning. Shawnee Indians rushed into the Stevenson cabin with knives and muskets. A friend of their father's, named Bonham, was immediately shot dead. Jenny's mom was also shot, but lived. Patsy somehow hit the door so hard that it forced the other Indians out, leaving one attacker. The remaining Indian used a knife to repeatedly stab her father, who could not get a hold of the knife. He yelled for his youngest boy, James, only 8 years old, to get the pistols that were hanging on the wall. The pistols had 2 triggers, and James pulled them so hard to fire at the Indian that he broke both triggers. He got the other pistol, and with one shot, killed the Indian that was attacking his daddy. Some people might say this incident is why all young Turpen boys are taught how to shoot at an early age. Jenny escaped through the loft window, but was caught by the Indians and taken away on horseback. Jenny was taken all the way to Fort Detroit, nearly 400 miles, and she was sold as a slave. A French trader bought her as a wife and dressed her in gaudy clothes. Jenny's older brother William was not home at the time of the attack, but once he learned what happened, jumped on a horse and went all the way to Detroit, as he knew Indians were trading with the French there. Amazingly, he found and rescued his sister and brought her home. She learned that her father had died from his wounds and that her mother could no longer walk. Jenny later married Moses Turpen, my grandpa, 22 April 1800, here in Madison County, Kentucky. They had 8 children and named their first boy William, after her brave brother that traveled nearly 400 miles to save his sister. Hey, I told you it was a big dramatic story, didn't I? For the promise of land and clear land titles, Moses and Jenny Turpen moved to what was Jackson County, Indiana, but that turned into Lawrence County when the county boundaries changed. They got 3 land grants for a total of 160 acres. Their first land grant was applied for in 1837, so they were there a little before that. And you know what? Their cabin is still there along Highway 50 and County Road 950 East, Buck Creek Road. In a few more years, it'll be over 200 years old. After Moses and Jenny passed away, their son Jesse, my dad, and my ma, Lucretia Hunter, bought the farm from my aunts and uncles and ran a grocery store and a distillery. You know, they made booze. Dad learned how from Mom's Hunter side of the family. They made a lot and sold a lot. Again, no one had TV back then. There's a family story about my dad Jesse. He was a character. He got in a land dispute with one of his wife's relatives, and this resulted in a day in court at the old Lawrence County Courthouse. On the day of the court case, Dad shows up and tells the judge that the other guy won't be showing up because he shot him. Dad had taken matters into his own hands and shot him off his horse. Not too long later, the guy shows up in court with a wounded shoulder, but said he was okay. I'll bet family reunions weren't the same after that. There are two types of Turpens, those that live in Indiana and those that don't. And there's a good reason for that. As I mentioned, my dad, Jesse, bought the farm from his brothers and sisters. Many of them wanted to go out west to Missouri and beyond, where the government was giving more land grants. Today, we have relatives all the way out in Kansas, Nevada, and California. And the really neat thing is, we know this because we found them while doing genealogy. Indiana Turpens were looking for them, and they were looking for us. It was kind of a hallmark moment. Turpen descendants in Indiana, Michigan, Kansas, Texas, Nevada, and California began working on a very detailed genealogy project back in the 1990s. And that resulted in a book that was compiled in 2006 and has been revised several times. The only thing missing was where are the graves of the first Indiana Turpens, Moses and Jenny Turpen. Maps were made of the farm, people went on expeditions, many graveyards were surveyed and photographed, courthouse and internet records were researched, but Moses and Jenny were never found. But that was the fun in it, working together as a family. Lots of wonderful memories were made at the reunions and during the years. And then, a random internet search found the grand prize, a picture of the grave and name of the graveyard. People had walked all around it at Gilgal Cemetery for over 30 years. This is the oldest Turpen gravestone in Indiana. Sadly, many that started the journey weren't alive to enjoy the moment. Wayne Turpen, Roberta Turpen Willett, Mac Elaine Elliott, all gone after years of research. But the story doesn't end there. Turpens that are still alive are making new stories that should be written down so people can read them long after they're gone. I mean, years later, how would anyone know that I, Edward Turpen, was in the Civil War twice as a young boy and have two gravestones side by side if no one wrote it down? The smaller one is spelled wrong, by the way. And how would anyone know that the Turpen twins were featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not for being born on different days at different places? It's really up to you to keep the history alive and the stories told. Well, I've got to go now. I'm dead tired.